thank you for here tonight. Watching the calendar.
When you test the mic beforehand, you will fail later, so just don't test it.
About that. Yes? Okay. So we're exactly 2 weeks from the start of Lent, when we will enter a period of personal reflection. But this year, the church is going to ask all of us to engage in a period not just of personal reflection, but of collective reflection, and to consider what collective moral responsibility we may have, what collective moral responsibility we may feel as members of various institutions, whether it's being a member of this church or this diocese, whether it's a member of schools where we graduated, places where we work, this city, this nation. And so, as we enter this period, tonight's event, if we had perfectly scheduled it, would have been part of a curriculum that will roll out during Lent, a curriculum that's going to involve sermons and a chance to engage with the clergy that are giving those sermons, with Sunday forums and Wednesday nights and discussions over books. All of that's going to be happening, and as I say, if we could have perfectly scheduled this would be the opening event in that Lenten curriculum, and it would have been maybe Lent 101. But consider tonight a state review, and it's this book that's really the springboard for tonight's conversation. A question of freedom, the families who challenged slavery from the nation's founding to the Civil War, published in 2020 by Yale University Press, which raises many of these questions. And we're fortunate tonight to have with us the author and other individuals who's closely connected with this book. This book, as you will hear more about, is about a little known chapter in American history, but an absolutely remarkable story that takes place over 70 years, involves 5 generations of families who resort to the legal system to petition for their freedom. Enslaved persons in Prince George's County in the District of Columbia who go to the courts in an effort to get their freedom, and the remarkable piece of this story is that in many cases they are successful. And you'll hear a little bit tonight about one of those persons, Edward Queen, who in 1794 petitions for his freedom. He has a jury trial. He secures a verdict that obtains not only his freedom, but damages from the person who enslaved him. And 2 years later, in 1796, his mother, Phyllis Queen, petitions for her freedom. And another jury trial, she secures her freedom. A jury of 12 men, 11 of the 12 are slaveholders, 5 of the 12 hold more than 30 slaves each. So this is an absolutely incredible story, and Will Thomas, who's with us, is the author of this book, which won the Mark Linton Prize for History, awarded as part of the J. Anthony Lucas Prizes given out by the Columbia School of Journalism and the Neiman Foundation at Harvard. He's a professor of history at the University of Nebraska. He's won the highest teaching award at the University of Nebraska. And afterward, you may want to ask him more about the $1 million grant that they just received from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, which will establish a digital repository for what I think he would say is the largest untapped source of historical evidence in the United States, which is local court records, which memorialize or record these various events throughout the United States, not just in Prince George's County or locally, to use the court system to secure freedom for any number of marginalized minority groups. And he was also an Episcopalian and a member of the Diocese of Nebraska, which, as many of you will remember, is the diocese where Jill Burnett was bishop. Jill Burnett, our interim rector before Whitley arrived. So we're delighted to have Will here. He's also a member of the board at Virginia Theological Seminary, where much of this book was written. And he's off to Trinity in Hartford later in the week because he's on the board. Also joining us tonight, and we're very fortunate to have Jeff Tidner, a graduate of Harvard, who then went off to Duke and now is a lawyer at the Federal Communications Commission, where he is one of the nation's experts in broadband wireless, president of the Harvard Club here. And remarkable in a couple of other ways, because when he graduated from Duke and came back to Washington, D.C., he was coming back to where his family has lived continuously since before the Civil War, and moved to his grandfather's house, as I understand it, in Ward 4. So the Tidner family has been in Washington, D.C. for a very, very long time. But he's also a descendant of the Queens, the Edward Queen and Phyllis Queen that I mentioned. So his history in this area goes back more than 200 years. And he and Will have met each other through the research for this book, and they are also the subjects of a play, which is still being written, had a reading and workshop, and will have its production in June of this year, as I understand it. So, and that play is about their encounter and about both their ancestors who intersect, but also about how they've engaged in this time and about this whole question of repentance and reconciliation and prayer. So we are absolutely delighted to have them here tonight to kick off Lenten Away. And I've told you it's just a snippet about Will's book, but let the first question be, Will, tell us about the book.
Thanks, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? All right. So Lane asked, first of all, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you. And I hope that this conversation tonight is part of a journey that we're all taking toward reconciliation. That journey began for me with this book almost from the beginning. When I started looking into these freedom suits, I went to the National Archives, and I had heard about an early freedom suit case, the Queen family case, Jeff's ancestors, and I pulled the court record from the National Archives, and the archivist behind the desk said, "Well, hey, have you seen this?" And he opened up this book of an index of all of these other court cases in Washington, D.C., all filed by black plaintiffs. And almost all of them were freedom suits. And, I'm a credentialed American historian, and I didn't really know about that early history of freedom suits. I knew about Dred Scott, of course, and cases later in right before the Civil War. But this early history of freedom suits at that level, that scale of hundreds of freedom suits in Washington, D.C. Now, I can say a lot about all of these cases, but I'll just say that I eventually read and sort of tried to understand all of them. And there are over 500 freedom suits just in Washington. And then I started following those cases back in time, because the families like the Queens, their case in Washington, D.C. included all of this testimony from earlier in Maryland. And so I thought, well, what's going on in Maryland? So I went to the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis and looked up those earlier cases. And there were hundreds more freedom suits in Maryland in the 1790s. The families had opened up essentially a new strategy of litigation in Washington, D.C. when they could in 1800, 1801 when D.C. was created. And all of these cases had predecessor cases in Maryland. And so the book is really about all of these families from Prince George's County, Maryland, who, Edward Queen among them, many of whom sued Jesuit slaveholders. Edward Queen sued John Ashton, the Reverend John Ashton, who was a trustee and a founder of Georgetown College. And so the Georgetown sale in 1838, that many of you may know about, became an important part of this. Is an important part of this history too. So Edward Queen and his mother and many cousins and relatives were successful, but others were not, as slaveholders really began to try to crack down on the kinds of evidence that could be used in these freedom suits. And the seminal case is one that comes before the Supreme Court called Queen v. Hepburn. It's the Queen family that brings this case with all the same evidence from Edward Queen's initial trial, and the Supreme Court rules that evidence inadmissible because it's secondhand testimony. Someone said they knew her mother, and she claimed she said she was free. So the hearsay rule, as it's called in American law, was really defined in this Supreme Court case. And
You might tell us who wrote the opinion.
yeah, Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the opinion, and Francis Scott Key was the attorney for the Queen family. And the more I dug into this and started looking at the early freedom suits that the Queens filed against the Jesuits and the later suits that were filed by the Queens and others against practically every slaveholder of consequence in Maryland and Washington, D.C., this story emerged really of these families who were from day one of the United States and before, I'll come back to that in a second, but at day one of the United States, were suing slaveholders contesting slavery. And they were contesting their personal enslavement, but they were also, in a larger way, I believe, contesting slavery and holding up the hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence with continued enslavement. And I guess I'll make one final comment. So, as I started working on this, I knew that my family, my ancestors were from Prince George's County, Maryland. My dad was an attorney. His mother was from Prince George's County, and the family is the Duckett family. They were early slaveholders and planters in Prince George's County. And I knew that. I knew they were slaveholders, but I had never really reckoned with that fact for myself. And I certainly had not looked into it really at all. And early on in this book, in the research for this book, Phyllis Queen, who Lane just mentioned, Edward's mother, in 1796, her petition for freedom was heard in Thomas Duckett's court. He was the judge. And his son, later, Allen Louis Duckett, one of the more notable ancestors in that line of my family, he was the attorney for the Jesuits against these freedom suits. Thomas Duckett, the judge, had let all the hearsay evidence in, and the Queen family gained their freedom in that courtroom, but he was also not a trained lawyer, and he was a planter, and we can't ascribe necessarily benevolent motivations to him. I don't know. But I was really trying to contend with this history and its meaning as I was working through this. And then I met Jeff and members of the Queen family. And the past was no longer the past. Right? This wasn't an academic subject anymore. This was both an academic, scholarly narrative that I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell it in an emotional way that would really make people care about this history differently. And it was also a present concern, because I realized that, yes, Thomas Duckett's courtroom, the Queens won their freedom in his courtroom. Yes, Allen Bowie Duckett represented the Jesuits, and later, he died very young, he was 35 when he was appointed to the D.C. bench. He was on the bench, and I kind of had the gradual realization that the Queens in Washington, D.C. they may have waited to file their lawsuit until he died. What is that? How do I reckon with that? But more particularly, as I was digging deeper into this history of the Queen family and the Duckett family, I looked at the 1864, the end of the American Civil War. Okay? Maryland conducted a census of slaveholders, of enslaved property, that slaveholders would be compensated for. Okay? The entire purpose of the census was to compensate slaveholders. Right? And there in the list of registrations is Elizabeth Duckett. And the only queens enslaved in 1864 were held by a member of my family. So it became very important for me to reckon with this history differently from my academic peers, or from maybe the standards, maybe of even the discipline. And there's been a lot of controversy lately, I'm sure some of you may have picked up on it in the New York Times about presentism in history and all that. So, but I think that's misguided, that we need it. The present, we are all living in the present with the legacy of all of our ancestors right now. This isn't separable, and I couldn't separate it. And so, much of the book is also drawn from my conversations with Jeff's family and other families that I tried to connect with. That work is ongoing. It continues. It's embodied right here, really. I guess I'll pause there and say,
I was going to say, you explained how this story involved you, Jeff. What did you know about this story? How did you and Will encounter each other? And maybe this leads into this play where both of you are characters.
Well, I didn't know too much about it, which is, I think, the thing that makes Will's book so special, and digging into the history. I just think there must be all these other families who are out there who have some similar story, something like that, but nobody's necessarily kind of dug into it yet. We, as sort of laying into that in the introduction, we had focused on the Tignor, my dad's side of the family, on that genealogy, where my dad had gone back to Civil War records and found our ancestors, one of my ancestors had fought for the Northern Civil War in Virginia, probably Northern Virginia, one of the counties not too far out. And then right after the Civil War, he moved to Washington, D.C., built a house on East Capitol Street, and that's how we sort of came to D.C. And so we didn't know as much on my mom's side of the family. What was interesting is they lived in since in Queenstown, which is a section of Anne Arundel County, my mom's last name is, Queen, prior to, getting married, so we're just clearly, direct descendants. But essentially, they live on land which is just adjacent to, in Prince George's County, where a lot of Will's book is taking place. So from that sense, like, our name is the same, people farm the same land, my mom's, parents did. And then I ended up growing up in Connecticut. My parents had kind of moved up there for work. But so it was, to Will's point of the past not being past, I mean, we're still there in the same neighborhood and everything. So it wasn't that hard to probably trace this and figure it out. And there are probably stories like that, all around that people don't, that people just don't have the information on. This may be a little bit not exactly answering the question, but, having gone to law school, it was really, amazing that the hearsay rule, one of the fundamental things you learn in evidence, like, didn't really put together that basic rule came from my family, because we didn't have that, we didn't just have that information. And so I think that's one reason, history is just so important. It's brought a lot of, color to other things. I feel like, in just other aspects of my life since, some of the scenes that took place in Will's book, where at the Maryland, Capitol, they were debating slavery. That's where I was sworn into the bar. I'm a Maryland bar member. So it's really, the history just doesn't, it's just not, it's not really past. I think one of my cousins, who's like photographed, I think, is in the book, who's a doctor at Georgetown, Letitia, which is pretty amazing. She's a doctor at Georgetown, yet we were part of the Georgetown slave sale. And so she contributed to Will's book. She's on my mom's side of the family, and contributed to the book, and her picture was in there, and she introduced us. And so we've kind of been friendly ever since. And I think just got along well, and I think it's just, I mean, it's in terms of, I don't know what I'm gonna say. Is how people act on what the word is, pens, any word. I feel like I've learned so much from Will's work and research on it that can't worry too much about things that happened 200 years ago or 250 years ago or something. So, but I think just doing work on this and educating people and putting it out there, I just think is so important. And it would be great. My son goes to Washington Episcopal School. I went to Episcopal Church as well, and I think he's 10, he's in 4th grade, and they had a family history thing. Like, where's your family from? Well, pretty much we're from this area. We can go back to 1715, I think, when our relatives first came here. And so, I think that's interesting. Without the book, we might not have known. We only could have gone back to the Civil War. We might not have known that we go all the way back to before the U.S. was a country, and in Maryland. So that's pretty good, and I think provides. I think he has the benefit. He'll have the benefit of knowing that history for his entire life instead of me finding it out in my 40s. So it's good.
Will, you touched on, I think, sort of a criticism you address in the book, which is historians before you tended to think these freedom petitions were not that important because they didn't raise the larger issue of whether slavery as an institution was wrong. And so I think it'd be interesting for you to talk us briefly about what the basis for these claims was. And what was the argument for why the Queens or others, Mahoney's, were entitled to their freedom?
Yeah, these early freedom suits, especially the Queens, but also the Mahoney's, another absolutely, I think those two are the most important freedom suits in American history. And yet most people don't know anything about them and they're not taught, and so I think we really have a lot of work to do to get this kind of history in front of people and in front of our children and in textbooks. So those two freedom suits were premised, each of them were different families. They do intermarry at different points, but fundamentally different ancestors in each of those. They're arguing that their maternal ancestor set foot in England and therefore was free. And could only have come to the colony of Maryland as an indentured person, not as an enslaved person. Now, there is an argument that historians have sort of made for years that the freedom suits are not very significant because they they were idiosyncratic. They were really about one family and not about slavery as a whole. But I'm cautious about that, because I think what that does is suggest that people can't be doing both things at the same time, attempting to liberate themselves and their family, and in some way challenge the lawfulness of this institution. But in the case of the Queens and the Mahoneys, their argument is really significant, because they are raising the freedom principle, the Somerset principle, from English common law and affirmed by the King's Bench in 1772. This England as free soil. They're raising that argument in a court, in a slaveholding state's court, and so it did put this issue on trial in a way. The lawyers for the Queens and the Mahoneys are saying outright, slavery is incompatible with natural law. It's incompatible with the Declaration of Independence. It's incompatible with the nation's founding. Flat out, they're making that argument in the Maryland High Court, it's a general court, and then in the Court of Appeals. So, yes, it's an argument about a particular family, but it's also clearly an opportunity, an avenue toward a larger argument about slavery.
I would just sort of add into that, sorry to jump in, but I believe in the book, Will writes about how essentially Maryland had adopted a lot of England's laws in that time, for all other purposes. But slavery was kind of, we wanted it both ways, essentially adopting the English common law, but still keeping slavery. So I think that was a tension there that was pointed out, in those suits.
I want to ask a question about making this connection between past and present again. And many of the people in this room will know that in the last couple of years there's been an investigation of our parish history. So we learned that the land on which this church sits was donated to St. Albans by a slaveholder. We learned that there was a bequest that allowed the building of this church to start. It was a bequest from that family that had its wealth from holding slaves. So there's a connection that we now know about that we might I thought before was very remote. But you're saying you knew about the Duckworths as slaveholders. Ducats, I'm sorry. But somehow doing this book brought it closer to home. For both of you, something about the book brought it all closer to home. Can you talk to us about what it means that it comes closer to home, and then where some sense of moral accountability comes into play because of that knowledge?
Well, for me, working on this book, I realized that, as I mentioned earlier, I found myself on a journey toward some kind of reconciliation or reckoning. And I guess the best way for me to put it is, and I think the perhaps theological way to, there were two parts of this, I guess I want to say. One is, I began to feel that in light of this history, that I was uncovering for myself and my family's involvement in Prince George's County, that I needed to work toward being in right relationship with other families affected by this history. So that was important to me as I met Letitia, as we met and tried to share this research, share what I knew faithfully, openly, and to try to build a right relationship with families who may have been harmed and were harmed in this history. So I went to Duke Divinity to a summer institute on reconciliation in 2017. And it was an intense week of focus and study on reconciliation in our lives as Christians. And so, and it was ecumenical, but there were a lot of Episcopalians there, actually. And it was nice. But by far, the most were Baptists and Catholics and all sorts of denominations were there. And it was really a transformative experience for me to be trying to reckon with this history in that setting, because we had to share. It was this sort of open sharing of where we are in this journey. And one of the things that I took away from that last point is, and the book is in many ways this, I think, it is a lamentation. I don't think I gradually just felt, as I tried to figure this out, that we don't lament what is happening very well. I think we are so eager to rush to reconciliation, or that we skip the stage of lamentation.
Preach.
Like, can we grieve over something? This harm that needs to be repaired. Can we lament what has happened? And I wanted the book to do that for the reader, like to help you lament what maybe without giving up, right? It's lamentation with the hope of reconciliation. But I don't think we can reconcile much if we don't actually lament anything. And so I came out of that experience and really in the meeting Jeff's family in 2017, 2018, 2019, and then as I'm trying to finish this in 2020, thinking about those two things: right relationship. Can we get in right relationship with God and with our community, right? And can we truly lament something and like this, like the facts that we know about how we are, who we are. So,
I would say that one thread in Will's book, just to build on something he just said, is that you can see in the book the harm that slavery caused to all involved. I think that was really one of the key things in the book. The Jesuits who were continuing to enable slavery just went to lengths that, as I just mentioned, were essentially twisting the law in Maryland. There was just a lot of, felt like, personal strife and just, things that were caused because people knew that this was, essentially not the right thing to do. You had to keep twisting yourself into a pretzel for it to continue. And I think the damage that was done to everyone involved is, I think that comes through in the book, and maybe that goes to the, lamentation point that Will is making. Otherwise, just from what I see, I think institutions are, struggling, and they're in a period of trying to figure out how to deal with this. As Lynn mentions the church and the land. As you mentioned, I'm the president of the DC Harbor Club. I was on campus there this winter, and they had essentially a slavery tour to Harvard, where you could see where, slavery's impact on that institution. And there are questions of, are there some buildings where there needs to be a plaque put outside, a building named for somebody who was, a significant slaveholder. And things like that, I think, are, one solution. Obviously, there's whole arguments about taking the names off of stuff, but in some ways I think it might be almost more productive just to put up a plaque, put up a sign that tells the full story, acknowledges who these people were, what happens, kind of happened at the time. And so I think that's just what a lot of institutions that I've been involved with are kind of wrestling with and trying to figure out. And I think they should go through that process probably and put out some plaques or do whatever people think is appropriate.
I'm going to let you ask questions. Anybody want to comment or ask questions, and I'll hand you the mic.
Thanks to both of you for a very moving presentation. Lane mentioned that St. Columbus has been doing some research as to its own past. I've kind of been particularly involved in that. And what we learned, as Lane mentioned, is the Murdoch family, who originally came here as Anglican priests in around 1850 or so, and rapidly, acquired land and enslaved people to work it. The Murdochs became a very prominent family. They were involved in the Stamp Act, were involved in the American Revolution. They ended up owning pretty much all of the land where we are today, down, to the Potomac River. So part of what I'm interested in is, first of all, if you have, and you probably don't know this off the top of your head, if there were any lawsuits against the Murdoch family, any of these freedom suits that you have read.
Right off the top of my head. I can't think of any, but I'll check and see.
Yeah, I'd be very, very interested in that.
Absolutely. Yeah. There was one against Bishop William Meade.
William, I'm sorry.
Meade.
Oh, Meade.
Bishop of Virginia.
Right.
Founder of the seminary. Yeah.
The other question that I have is, given this fairly now remote, it's very real. This land was worked by enslaved people that were owned by the Murdochs, who made really this church possible through their contributions of land and wealth. What can we do about it? What should we do about it? Do you have any perspective on that?
Well, I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I will tell you one thing that we do at the Harvard Club before all our board meetings. We have a land acknowledgement that acknowledges the Native Americans who own basically, essentially a lot of land, here in Washington, D.C. A long time ago. And I went to a movie recently where there was an extensive land acknowledgement just that took place prior to that. So, to the extent that, there can be some acknowledgement that seems appropriate. I'm sure there are sources that can help in tracking something, but to that extent, that may be one option.
I'll just say, I think we can work on taking a journey as a parish, right? And then it sounds like that's what you're doing in Lent and beyond, I would think. This can't be resolved with one act of the vestry, This is about really all of us together building a community that acknowledges this history, but again, is hopeful in reconciliation and hopeful in the future. So I just think it's a work. It's going to take time. It's going to take time. It's going to take real. As folks say, you got to do the work. We got to do the work. We got to know the history. Got to really think about it, pray about it, and do the work. And so it's just not one thing, I guess I would say. Yeah. It sounds like you are. And
Well, we're trying.
Yeah.
Just a quick share. I went last year with my granddaughter, who was touring colleges as a high school senior. We went to Georgetown, and I was very impressed because the student guide started with an acknowledgement of the land that had been owned by the Indians, the Native Americans, but then she went on to give a small sketch of what had happened in terms of the Jesuits and the slaves that were owned. So I really thought that was great to share that. And the other thing is, I am a retired educator, administrator in Montgomery County, and I'm so distressed at the banning books.
Yeah.
Fortunately, that's not the case in Montgomery County, but I certainly hope that your book, if it's appropriate, would be something that would be looked at for high school studies. And of course, this is Black History Month, but every month is Black History Month. American history.
Could you just make it to
My question may seem more about my knowledge of history than about what's important, but I have to say that freedom suit is not a term of reference that I have heard before, and I'm curious where the notion came from that an enslaved person could go to court and have slaveholders judge, and that there would be any merit in doing that given the cultural norm of the time.
Right.
How did it come about?
Yeah.
Which one?
Yeah, that's a great question. How did these suits come about? Well, first of all, we tend to think that slavery is just one thing, and it is, and we tend to think of it in 1858, right before the Civil War, that is what we're talking about. But slavery and the history of 300 years of enslavement, there was a great variety, right, in the development of slavery in the United States. In fact, just yesterday, I was here doing some research to try to look back before the Revolution. My book really starts with the Revolution and post-Revolution, just what happens after the Revolution. When Edward Queen, in 1791, in 1789, the Jesuits decide they're going to start selling slaves. And in 18 months later, Edward Queen sues for his freedom. So this is sort of the beginning point for the book. But I went yesterday to the Maryland Archives to look. I found 44 freedom suits going back to the 17th century in Maryland. Okay? So this is happening, in the colonial period, before the provincial colonial court. And then, of course, it happens after the American Revolution with newfound legitimacy of the revolutionary liberty. But the answer to your question is really, going back to English common law, the idea that someone cannot be simply detained and enslaved or held in bondage without any trial or without justification. And so slavery in the colonies develops, but slavery in England is seen as and by law seen as odious, as I mentioned. So these suits start early, and they're really focused on claiming personal freedom, right? Using the court to validate their claim. And colonial courts heard these petitions. They were called, the term today is freedom suits, but at the time they were petitions. The person was petitioning the court, okay? And then the common law right to petition the court. It comes out of both the habeas corpus tradition and the basic idea that there's a right to petition an injustice.
How were Queen family members and other people able to find lawyers? And I think that's an interesting one. I can't remember. We'll talk about it a little in the book. And I would say that it also points out there are complicated historical figures like Francis Scott Key, who represented our family at one point, but was also a slaveholder. And so it's really, so he was one of the lawyers who was representing people. So I'm not going to answer the question, but it continues to, talk about the race, the ambiguity of everything. And of course, everything's happened with the national anthem and all of that. And, since it's really, it's just, it's really incredible how entangled it all is.
Right.
But anyway, how were people able to get lawyers?
Yeah, I mean, the Queen family had been in Maryland for 3 or 4 generations, right, in Prince George's County, and Francis Scott Key's uncle is right there, and so is Gabriel Duvall, and so is Samuel Chase. All of them became basically Supreme Court justices or federal judges, and in Key's case, Key's uncle was a congressman. So I think what I try to show is there's more enslaved, first of all, enslaved people, families like the Queen's, possessed knowledge. They possessed legal knowledge. They possessed legal acumen, right? They were actors, historical and political and legal actors in this period. They were, and I'm going to borrow a phrase from Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes about this in The Case for Reparations. It's a crucial, I think, reading for this subject. But Coates says, we've got to stop seeing enslaved people as inert. It's the Queens, and what I'm trying to do in this book is really show the family's actions. They are, because their words were written down in the record, were inadmissible in court because of the hearsay rule. Their actions are in front of us, and their actions can resonate across these generations to us today to tell us something. And those actions tell us that these enslaved families were not inert, waiting for emancipation or some war or something. They were constantly enacting their lives. And in the case of the Mahonys, that was a freedom trial for Charles Mahoney that took 12 years. There were 3 jury trials, 2 appeals, 12 years of litigation. At one point, the jury finds him to be a free man. Of course, it's taken up on appeal, overturned, sent back to the jury trial. New evidence is, I think, manufactured, concocted, and he is deemed a slave for life, to use the term. And yet, he then negotiates for and purchases his freedom. So this is what this action is happening all around us, and then it takes him 12 more years for him to buy his daughter to free her. 25 years. Charles Mahoney challenges slavery in the High Court of Maryland, and that's why I think this history is so important for us to. So, but it's like not that. Following those actions is what I really think we want to do and think about.
But at the time, I know that there was an effort not to teach reading or writing.
Not Maryland. That was not law in Maryland. It was elsewhere.
That would seem like a very critical element in being able to have agency and to bring it through.
Charles Mahoney is not literate, but others are. And Michael Shiner, whose diary is at the Library of Congress right now, I just, in June, went and looked at it. It's astonishing. It's the diary of an enslaved man. And then he sues for his freedom, and he wins his freedom in the 1830s. But he learns to read and write in church in Washington, D.C. And he worked at the Navy Yard for his entire life. He was a painter and a laborer in the Navy Yard. And his diary is unbelievable.
I just wanted to thank both of you for doing this work and being here with us. And I want to thank you, Will, as a white man, for saying, especially for us white people, we have to lament what happened. And there is such an effort in that rush toward reconciliation, a word that is perhaps not one appropriate to use at this time. Maybe the rush toward reparations would be even more accurate. But when you turn to reckoning, and I think against the incredible scholarship you are doing is this counter-national movement to crush all of this work that has been accruing, particularly by black scholars, by scholars of color, by many women scholars, and by some white men like you, to really put the full history out there. So the move, I mean, another thing we could think of doing as a church, Carolyn talked about worrying about the banned books. I think of them not as banned, but as burning books. And who else burned books? This is where we are now. And in Florida, DeSantis has made it a law in the public schools not to include information in the classroom that would make white people uncomfortable. And he has begun to work in higher ed, and there's a whole series of, sorry, I can't remember the name of the conservative group that's giving the profile of how to work these laws through the legislature. So in 17 states, they're considering this kind of banning of thinking, so that your book could be one of those burned books. That kind of knowledge could be dangerous because, in fact, it's un-American. I want to give you a hopeful story, which is I think it's South Carolina, where they have this requirement to teach I think a constitutional civics course with a focus on the key documents. This was really meant as a conservative effort. What one of the people is doing, they said, great, we'll take it. And they started, and one of the courses they created is to put the Constitution next to what they call freedom documents. I don't know if they use freedom suits, but that would be wonderful to put your book right next to it, because those next to them are part of the American history and dialogue that we need to do, and would raise all these complicated things for the students to think about. But I do think there's a role for us to play within our church, not to sit silently, to use, if not the church influence, but our own influence to try and say, this is not the kind of education, this is not the kind of country we want. We want more of the example that comes from learning how Black people had agency, had wisdom, had insights, and had fight to try and get the kind of freedom that they deserved and didn't get.
Thank you. I have you sparked my interest by talking about how slavery was not one thing, but it was a different thing, a changing thing, I guess, over several hundred years. Did these freedom suits, the successful ones in the early days, did they create a backlash as time went on, and did it become more entrenched, the slaveholders' efforts to block these things?
Yes, that is a big thread of mine, through line in the book. Yes. So these freedom suits are contested, right? And they're, I mean, think about that. Suing the slaveholder, right? Individually. Yeah. This is in civil court. And bringing the enslaver into court to face to face to essentially contest slavery. There's no question that after the Queen family's case in the Supreme Court in 1813, it's kind of a high watermark because all of this hearsay evidence is coming in. Some of these families won hundreds of cases, right? And gradually, the Maryland legislature tries to, by various means, clamp down. They started in the 1790s, really, almost immediately after Edward Queen files his freedom suit. They changed the jurisdiction. These cases can't be tried in the general court, which met in the State House. That's what Jeff was just referring to when you were sworn in. You were sworn in literally at the place where Edward Queen's case was heard, literally on the marble, because the General Court of the Western Shore met in the State House in Annapolis. In the old park today, it literally met in the Great Hall. Okay? There was the House chamber, the Senate chamber, and the court met in the hall. The bar was literally right there in the Great Hall, just past the rotunda. And so, think about that. This is in front of everybody. Everybody's in the hall. That's where the court's being heard. Everybody's milling about. There's hundreds of people in there. And these families are suing for their freedom in front of everyone. This isn't a court with a closed door, and this is the hall. So it's public and it's well known, and the challenge that those cases brought to an individual enslaver, right? Pretty significant. So the first thing the legislature does is say, well, the general court of the Western Shore shouldn't hear these cases anymore. It should be heard only at the county court, where the slaveholders in Prince George's County, like my Ducat ancestors, maybe had a stronger control, you know? The general court drew its jury from Baltimore all up and down the Western Shore. So there was suspicion that those juries would be less inclined to perpetuate slavery.
But there were slaveholders.
There were, and yeah, Lane did. That's true. It is absolutely true. There's some very particular things that I try to talk about in the book. But yes, after the Queen cases and that high watermark in Maryland, eventually Maryland passes a law that believe it or not, there had been no law that Maryland passed that said slavery is this. Okay? Like, slavery was not defined by law. It was just inherited as a condition and reinforced in the courts. So Maryland closes that loophole in 1837, and they declare that slavery is allowed in Maryland. And part of they're reacting to this, to the rising abolitionism, to the freedom suits, and yes, there's a definite backlash, as you put it, for sure.
To a couple of your questions about lawyers and how, and the people who were on the jury. I asked Will this question years ago, certainly about, Francis Scott Key. If he was a slaveholder, was he really doing his best legal work for our family back then? It will seem to think he probably was, but it's just very, it's very hard to know. So I think, to your point, it's hard to know what you're going to get, whether it's jury, whether it's legal representation, even if people in the family do kind of know the law. I would say the dissent in Queen versus Hepburn, it could have been written, last week. Like, if you take a look at it, it's just, I cannot remember the details of it, but the importance of, freedom and what America stands for, and just that it should not, that this person should be free. I mean, that dissent could have been written last week.
Thank you. I was really taken with the image you gave us of the past moving into the present, and that somehow, as the past moves into the present, what does that mean for your sense of moral accountability, and how does the past then press upon you or upon us? And I just wanted to, what came to mind for me was the writings of a Presbyterian pastor, well-known author, Frederick Buechner, who does a lot of writing about his own life and his own past. And at one point he says, and I'm paraphrasing, if you believe as I do that God speaks to us in the very essence and the activities of our daily lives, then to forget what's happened in our past is to forget the Word of God that was spoken to us and in our midst. And I think he goes on to say, and so to remember is to remember the Word of God. And so as you spoke about that action, the agency that was going on, all in that mix in the past, and how that is somehow the presence of God in the middle of that just seems strong and apparent as I listen to you. So thank you.
It's 8 o'clock. So we'll linger for a bit, but thank you for being here, and Will, thank you so much.